I want to talk about my new Substack post. Is it better to get 4 SARS-CoV-2 infections or 5 in your long and lengthy life? So now that we've reached a point where I think more and more people are increasingly recognizing that breakthrough is not avoidable, it's inevitable, I see a new line of logic being argued. This logic goes that even though breakthrough is inevitable, even though all the vaccinated boosted people will get breakthrough, we should still try to avoid as many SARS-CoV-2 infections as possible. You should try to lower your cumulative lifetime COVID-19 infections to as low as possible because we don't know what kind of bad things might happen from getting this over and over again. That's the claim. And so somebody like me, 37 years old, hoping to live another 40, 50 years, God willing, somebody like me should try to take precautions. Maybe wear an N95 at times, maybe avoid some gatherings, so that in the course of my lengthy life, I only get 4 breakthroughs instead of 5. That's the logic. Well, I got a number of questions here, a number of questions and concerns. Number one, I'm not very clear on whether or not what we're doing is actually delaying the number of cumulative lifetime infections. I think that's speculatory. There's not a lot of high-level data that making people wear N95s year after year after year, or only when they think it's the right time, which might be totally off the mark, actually decreases cumulative lifetime infections. I don't know if that to be true or not. I do know that people have been reinfected, and I do know that people have had vaccination and have breakthrough, and I think it's very likely that everyone will eventually be infected. And like other circulating coronaviruses, it is likely that every few years you might get it again. But I don't see any evidence to think that the 4th or 5th time will be worse than the 1st or 2nd time. If anything, the first time is probably going to be the worst time, and it's just going to get milder with subsequent infections. I don't see any reason to think otherwise. That's not true for any other respiratory viruses. I also don't see any logic to this because for years we've had all these respiratory viruses circulating, and nobody told me I should take all these precautions because I want to have 22 colds in a lifetime, or 21 instead of 22, or 52 instead of 53, or however many colds we get in our lifetimes. They're probably too many to count. I don't know how many I've had. I've had too many to count. So I'm not persuaded that this is something worth pursuing. And certainly, whether or not the harms and negative externalities of social isolation are worth it. I mean, you're talking about, I think, big drops in mental health. You're talking about having to live in a constantly worried state. And you're talking about deploying an intervention that does reduce quality of life. I mean, it is better to meet people without having to wear the mask. I mean, if that weren't the case, would people look nostalgically back at 2019? I think many of us look nostalgically back to those days. So it clearly has a negative impact, and whether or not it has a positive impact is entirely speculatory. The real question is, why do people start saying this? Why are people suddenly, for the first respiratory virus in human history, saying it's better to get it 4 times than 5 times? Why are they starting to say this? And I think it's because the argument for restrictions is really completely eroded. That argument had some logic, I think, pre-vaccination. You could have done restrictions that actually worked. The failure, of course, is that we know very little about what works and what doesn't, but you could have done things that actually worked because the goal was getting to vaccination. But once you get to vaccination and the 2nd dose and the 3rd dose, and even for some people the 4th dose, what is the goal anymore? The additional risk reduction of an nth dose on hospitalization is approaching the asymptote of 0. And so what is the value of delaying infection until the nth dose? I think it's really questionable if there's any value at all. And I think most people are voting with their feet, and that's why most of America's returned to normal. And yet you find this argument being made by some people online, and of course it gains tractions in the communities that are partial to this message. I also read about how COVID-19 infections might cause some distant malady, some distant problem. Even if you have a mild infection today, you might have a distant problem. I think this is a very bizarre claim. We wouldn't have allowed this claim in most of biomedicine, that somebody could claim that in 1992 I had a rhinovirus infection, and that's why I've developed X, Y, or Z problem in 2012. I mean, I don't think we would have been accepting of such a claim without extraordinary evidence that there is a link. And that's what we need to bring here. Respiratory viruses can be terrible, but once you recover, I think many people, many, many years later, having a distal problem, the presumption has to be that it's unrelated, and the burden has to be to prove that it's somehow related. And I haven't seen that for some distant manifestation many, many years later. Even the things people consider long COVID symptoms, even those are things that are arising soon after the infection. They're not arising 4 years later, for instance, because 4 years haven't elapsed. And yet I hear this sort of speculation. So I'm not persuaded that fewer lifetime infections is better than one more. I'm not persuaded that doing these things actually decreases cumulative lifetime infections. I'm not persuaded by any of this argument. And I really start to wonder why people are grasping for straws here and why people think this argument will be considered by anyone who has thought twice about this issue. I really don't know. So those are my thoughts on this. I think that once you've done the most to lower your risk of bad outcomes, you really have to ask yourself, what are you taking part in restrictions for? What is the goal in delaying? How many years you plan on being around here? I'm hoping to be around 40, 50 years. I expect to be infected with this virus many, many times over. I'm grateful for the vaccine because I think the outcomes are going to be great for me. I'm also, thankfully, a young person. And I'm not sure that me taking precautions to go from 5 to 4 makes any sense. I'm also not persuaded at all that it'll benefit anyone else also, because me taking precautions is a grain of sand on a beach across all the oceans, and there's a universe of normal behavior going on, so me doing anything is not going to make a lick of difference. And of course, governments have no ability to compel the majority of the grains of sand on the beach to do anything, so I think it serves no purpose. So those are my thoughts on this issue. You know what to do. If you like this, like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.